Insanity seems to be going around quite a bit in the world today. Would any of you agree? I have a favorite definition of insanity. There are a lot of definitions of insanity. Some of you may know my favorite definition of insanity because I've told it before. It may be yours as well. Does anybody have a favorite definition of insanity? Yeah. That's my favorite one as well. Yes, to do the same thing over and over and over again, but expect a different result. Right? To do the same thing over and over and over and over again, but to expect a different result. That kind of thing can happen in my life where I just get into habits, I get into routines, I get into things that may be healthy and they may be not healthy. You may have experienced this in your past, you may be experiencing it right now. We're just doing the same thing and you're wishing that your life would get better or you're wishing that the world would get better and yet you do not change a thing. But are just like, oh, God's going to take care of it. Something's going to change. It's got to get better, right? It's got to get better. But we do the same thing over and over and over again just while expecting a different result. Insanity. And one of the main behaviors that we have, one of the main ways that we act in the world is how we spend our money. And I want to make something very clear. I am not making a pitch for money in this message. I'm making a pitch for your heart. I'm making a pitch for who you are going to be in this world. I am making an argument, I am making a point that says there is something that you can do to fundamentally change how you act that will fundamentally change the result of your life and the result of the direction of this world. It is that powerful and it can impact you that much because how we spend is one of the most powerful reflections of who we are. That's true as an individual, it's true for me, it's true for you, it is true for this church. And when we have the annual meeting after, our budget is a reflection of who we are. And when we talk about that, we should be thinking about that. What are we putting things towards? What are you putting things towards? And this is not true of everybody, but this is true of the vast majority of Americans. Right? The vast majority of Americans, this is how we look at our money. First, we're like, spend. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We have certain needs to survive, certain things we need to do, and so we spend on our needs. But the typical thing is we don't usually stop there. Right? We also have things that we want, and that's okay. Right? It's okay to buy things that you want and have a good time and enjoy yourself. I'm not saying not to enjoy yourself. We like to have fun in this church. It's one of the things that makes us special. I'd like you to have fun at home too, right? But what can happen is even after we've got our needs and our wants met, we can feel like that is not enough. And so we go into debt. There's so much debt in this country. And I'm not talking about the national debt. I'm not talking about deficits. I'm not talking about politics in that way. I'm talking about personal debt. Not because people need things, but because people can't stop buying because that's what society tells us gives us worth and makes us better for a little while until we end up in this debt. And then it's like, save. Some of you may save, we may save. That's not a bad thing. But you know what? There's so little saving going on amongst so many individuals in the world. Not because they can't, because they choose not to. The needs and the wants and the not enough and more leads to debt, leads to not saving, leaves a very, very small balance or a negative balance for God. And when God is your last priority, don't be surprised at the results you get. When God is your last priority, do not be surprised at the results you get in your life or the results that we get in the world. And those of you who have known me for a while know that these like little things, this here right here is my symbol for God, like light in the world. And God will leverage your light, but if you don't give much light, God can't leverage you very well in the world. God can't work with you. It's like, well, God can do anything. Of course God can. But God works best with what you offer up. And if you offer up just part of yourself, you just offer up a little after you've exhausted everything else in the world, and you just say, oh, God, I need your help. I'm not saying God doesn't want to help, but God can only help with what you give God to help with. But what does that have to do with the scripture about the disciples going out and tossing nets out and not getting fish, and then Jesus telling them, toss it to the other side, and then you're going to be able to get fish. Well, here is what's going on in the story. This scene happens a lot in the Gospels. This scene is one of the very first scenes in the first gospel we have. The gospel according to Mark is the oldest gospel that we have. And in chapter 1 of the first gospel, they are out fishing. And in Luke chapter 5, they are out fishing, and this is where Jesus calls the disciples. And the first thing he's doing is they're out fishing. They've been out all night. They've got nothing. They're exhausted. And they come back in and they have nothing. And then Jesus is like, go back out just a little ways and you're going to get some fish. And they're like, we're exhausted, Jesus. We don't want to do this. And they do it and they get the fish. So this is what was going on before. Now we are in chapter 21 of John. John is the last gospel. Would anybody like to guess how many chapters there are in John if we're reading John 21? Not a trick question. 21 chapters. 21 chapters. So there's always a point here, right? So at the very first chapter of the very first gospel and the very last chapter of the very last gospel, they're doing the same thing. So before they were doing that, and then even after they've spent years and years and years with Jesus, they go back the same thing. This is the last chapter. What are they supposed to be doing? What are they supposed to be doing? Jesus has died. Jesus has been resurrected. Jesus has given them direction. What is the direction? Did Jesus say, okay, everybody, when I'm done here, when I go, I need you all to go back to what you were doing before you ever met me? No, what were they supposed to be doing? Right, fishing for men, fishing for people, fishing going out there for people who ever needed them to go change their lives, to give them the good news of forgiveness of debt, the good news of the end of oppression, the good news that you are loved even if you are on the bottom. You are loved no matter what. That's the message they're supposed to be bringing out there. But what are they doing? They're fishing. They're doing the same thing that they always have. They go back to casting the net in the exact same way. They go back to doing the same thing over and over and over and over again, even though they have spent years with Jesus. I have people come into my office, we sit down, we talk, and they're like, gosh, if I could just talk with Jesus, it would change everything. Disciples spent 3, 4, 5 years with Jesus. Went right back to doing the exact same thing they were doing before. You're not alone. The heroes of the Bible do the exact same thing, and Jesus knows this, which is why Jesus is like, I need you to do something else. You keep casting your net in the same place, in the same way, in the same Sea of Galilee, Sea of Tiberias, same place, Sea of Tiberias and Sea of Galilee, same thing. You keep doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result. I need you to try something different, and if you do that, I promise you the result will be different. And so Jesus is asking, do you love me? Because right after this passage, Jesus takes Peter aside and walks along the beach. We have that passage where Jesus says, do you love me? And asks Peter this 3 times, but sometimes we forget. In the first time he asks the following, do you love me more than these things? Do you love me more than these things? And what he's referring to is the fishing equipment. What he's referring to is these other things that he's always done. Do you love me, Peter? Because I asked you to go do something, and as soon as I'm gone, you just went back to doing what you did before, you and the rest of the disciples. So do you love me more than these things? And that is the same question that Jesus is asking us as well. Because the questions being asked of the disciples are the same questions Jesus is asking us today. Do you love me more than these? And for us, what are these things? Do you love me? Are you willing to do this? Do you love me more than these habits that you have that are so ingrained that you just keep doing them over and over and over again, regardless of whether you think it's giving you a good life, regardless of whether you think it's positive for the community, regardless of whether you think it is good for the world? Do you love me more than these habits? Do you love me more than these wants that are putting you in debt? Do you love me more than these wants that are keeping you from coming to a place and helping somebody in need? Do you love me more than these wants that you have to feel comfortable that keeps you from doing uncomfortable things to help people who you know are hurting, but you're uncomfortable walking up to them and saying, can I help you? Do you love me more than your own comfort? Do you even love me more than debt? Seems like an obvious question. Seems like an obvious answer. Do you love Jesus more than debt? Of course I love Jesus more than debt. What are the actions saying? What are the behaviors saying? What is your spending saying? This is not me asking you to give money to this church. Don't wince, Scott. Our financial director. You don't know Scott. He's the head financial. He's brilliant. He holds this place together with all, making sure we know where everything's going and how we're going to do these things. And in the annual meeting, you'll see why. But this is not a pitch for your money. This is a pitch to say, where is your priority with your life? Where's your priority with your actions? And where's your priority with your spending? Because your spending is one of the top reflections of who you are as a human being. And so where will you put your heart? Will you, even if it's a tiny bit, start with the first money you have? The first money. It doesn't have to be your first 10%. It doesn't have to be your first 1%. Start with $1. Can you do that first and then spend? Can you do that first and then spend? And after you do that, can you decrease your debt? Because the more debt you have, the more you are enslaved to other people and not free to be able to do what it is that God is calling you to do. And then after that, will you invest? And I'm not saying save here, and I mean this in a very specific way, because one thing is saving. You take some money, you set it aside, you watch it grow. Investing in a God way of investing is knowing what you're investing in. And this is something I need to do. I'm not calling everybody, this is something I need to look in more deeply as well. Because when I invest, that money goes to a bunch of investors, and they invest it for me, and I don't know what they're investing in. That money is being put to use for something that I don't know, and it may not be aligned with my values. It may not be aligned with who I am as a person. In fact, it may be undermining the very beliefs that I'm preaching about right now because I don't know where my money is invested. Your money is working for something. Is it working for what you believe in, or is it working against what you believe in? If we do this, we will have very little spark, very little leverage, very little that we're offering up for God to be able to use. When we do this, we get God math, which brings this kind of light. Which brings this kind of light, which brings this kind of results, which you've seen, this 169,000 for those of you who weren't here for it. This is the number of meals. Look at this community of faith. We are not a mega church. We are not a mega church. 169,000 meals have been provided to this community of Bloomfield in the last 6 years by this community of faith. That's astonishing. We get used to some of these numbers because you all crush it so much. But this is how that, go around that way, please? This is an astonishing result that happens when you do this. One other thing. Does anybody remember what this board is? What is it? Bottle and can drive, 10 cents a pop. Right? Back at the beginning of Lent, I said, let's go try to collect 47,000 bottles and cans, or the equivalent if you want to make a donation. You didn't want to save the cans. One, because it's good for the environment, because the stuff that you put in your recycling bin does not, in fact, typically get recycled. At least not as high as the rates as when you bring it directly to the redemption center. So good for the environment. And when I came up with this idea, Linda, you said, what about my idea? Something bad, right? She doesn't remember the exact words, but she said, I said something bad. It's a horrible idea. Yes, I think that was the exact phrase. It is a horrible idea. And she wasn't wrong, right? She wasn't wrong. But the fact is that people here took hold of it. John made organizing tables. Osmo organized the whole community of faith. Dave Nail uses his pickup truck to go bring things. Gillette Riggs donates their bottles and cans from the golf course to help us. Right? These things. And now we just went, the goal was 47,000, we just crossed 50,000. What do we do now?
Keep going.
That's right. So we're going to redraw this. It's going to be up to 100. And we're going to be able to do it because all of you together, because we can't do this on our own. We can only do this because so many people participated, so many people from the community. And you should have seen the look on Ozma's face when I just said 100,000. Right? Something like this. Something like this. But it's beautiful, and what this goes to and what this goes to be able to change the world and help things like this happen is what changes things. And it happens when we do this first. And so the question is, for you in your life, where are those places where you want things to be different, but you keep doing the same thing? Where can you cast your net differently than you have cast it before? That you might not know what the results are going to be, but you know what the other ones are because you've been doing it for so long. Where are the places you can cast your net to just see what happens? Call it an experiment. Don't even scare yourself by saying, I'm totally changing my life right now. Just cast the net like once over there and see how it goes. Where can you cast your net differently to potentially change how your life is lived? And us as a community of faith, we as Bloomfield Congregational Church, where are we going to cast our nets in the future? Because we matter in this community. We matter in this community. We matter in the region. We matter in the world and the decisions that we make, and we've done a good job of not just doing the same thing over and over and over again. The danger is then thinking that what we're doing now just is constantly repeated, and we don't continue to throw our nets in new directions. And so we need to ask ourselves continually, where are we going to throw our nets in the future to be able to change people's lives, to be able to reduce the insanity, to be able to bring love and compassion and acts of loving kindness and justice into a world that so desperately needs it. You matter, every single one of you, and collectively we as a church matter so profoundly as community. These things are powerful, and you are powerful. So I just ask you to think as we go out of here with your day and your year, where are you going to cast your net? Amen.